Before we begin, a content warning. This episode contains candid discussions about spiritual, emotional, and institutional abuse, and may include references to misconduct that are difficult to hear. There may also be occasional strong language. Many of the individuals I've interviewed for this series, survivors, witnesses, and former pastors, are still navigating the long-term effects of what they experienced inside the Vineyard movement. Several have spent years in therapy, and even now, speaking openly about it takes courage. So please take care as you listen. Throughout Spoiled Fruit, I've shared excerpts from interviews to help shape the narrative, but some conversations deserve to be heard in full. This is one of them. In this episode, I sit down with Ryan Bauers, a former Vineyard pastor from Duluth, Minnesota, who is among the first to formally raise concerns to Vineyard USA about Michael and Brenda Gatlin. That was in 2014. At the time, Ryan submitted a detailed letter outlining leadership red flags, toxic dynamics, and a culture of spiritual abuse developing under the Gatlins. But his warnings, like so many others, were minimized, dismissed, or buried. Ryan's perspective is essential, not only because of how early he spoke up, but because his story reveals just how long Vineyard USA had the opportunity to act and didn't. As with the Chris Sauter interview, this full-length conversation is part of my ongoing effort to give space to voices that deserve to be heard in full. And to those of you supporting the show as exclusive subscribers, thank you. I'll be sharing several additional full interviews with you soon. This is my full conversation with Ryan Bauers. All right, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on. Tell me a little bit, we'll jump right in. Tell me about how you first got involved with Duluth Vineyard and what drew you to that community specifically.
Yeah, well, I was actually a vineyard pastor in the same town as Duluth Vineyard. So Michael and Brenda and I were sort of, colleagues in the same city. I was the lead pastor of a church that I started in 2001 with a group of folks. And so we got connected with the vineyard in about 2005 and eventually became a vineyard church, kind of went through that process of becoming a vineyard church. So I, during that time was, connected to Michael and his church planting. He was working half-time for the National Vineyard Office. As a church planting, the church planting guy. And so I was on his church planting team. I was speaking at regional conferences. I was part of the kind of regional cohort helping to coach other church planters. So that's how I was kind of connected to those guys.
So tell folks a little bit about what were your initial first impressions of the leadership there, especially regarding, obviously, Michael and Brenda, as they were the sort of like co-lead pastors there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that as we look back on things, Michael and Brenda were both really warm. They were kind. They were good at what they did. And I think that those talents propelled them forward in the vineyard. They were successful. Their church at the time that we met was smaller than my church, actually. And then they just kind of blew up. They were doing all the right things and moved into a new building and just exploded. And, Michael is a very talented person and very skilled. And I think that one of the things I reflect on as I look back is, no one is either all bad or all good, right? We have these, really good skills and gifts, and some of those skills and gifts that are our greatest assets can also be detriments in our lives. And so, yeah, they were kind, they were giving, they were father and mother figures to a lot of younger leaders, which actually I think became part of the problem because they were in relationship with people that were younger than them. And so the younger people I remember talking to several staff people that they didn't like Michael and Brenda's actions or the way that they were speaking to people, but what were they to do? Because they're on staff of the church and they, sort of adored Michael and Brenda as mother and father figures. So there were sort of these, disapproving or really approving mother and father figures in the lives of young leaders. And um, so, there were definitely some red flags. Michael and I were pretty close for a while. We would spend, an hour or two together every week, just chatting about life and ministry and theology. And when I was going through my process of becoming an LGBTQ affirming pastor, I actually had Michael really listening to me and open to what I was presenting to him. And then there was sort of a moment where I think he felt like he knew that if he chose that direction, it would cost him big time in the vineyard. And so he kind of came down hardline on one end. So, um, my impressions of them were good. And there were some concerning behaviors as well.
Yeah, so that's a good transition into that. So talk about, like, was there a specific moment or pattern when you started to feel like something was off in the leadership culture there?
Yeah, well, I was friends with the Gatlins, but I was also, close to several people on their staff. And so behind the scenes, I would hear of Michael, talking down to people, really kind of using demoralizing language, using words that were kind of extreme, like, well, you're just not vineyard enough, or you're just not godly enough to understand that. And so kind of denigrating people's own ability to have, their own discernment, and especially staff people. And so I know several staff people were uncomfortable with sort of the untouchable factor of Michael and Brenda. You couldn't really question them, or you would be like, well, why would you question them? They're the godly leadership. They're the ones who have been called. And um, you know, uh, no doubt that they had been called, but goodness sakes, we can all have humility and do wrong things. So, yeah, so some of the way that they were treating their staff, some of the way that they were engaging with others around. I know there are other pastors in the area who have described their experience with Michael. Him being successful church planter and them being kind of lazy or not as effective or not good at what they were doing. I know there are people that have gone on record saying, being under Michael's church planting coaching was one of the most demoralizing things I've ever, was part of in my life. One person said it set me back 20 years in my own um, self identity and ability to believe in myself. So, yeah, there were definitely concerns. There were concerns around theology again, where it was because at the time, if folks remember this in the Vineyard, there was a large network of Vineyard churches at the time that were connected to what was called the Blue Ocean Network, and that was Dave Smeltzer and folks out of Boston. Just trying to figure out how to do church differently and kind of innovatively and progressively. And under Burt Wagner, the former national director for Vineyard, that was encouraged. Burt was actually at several of those Blue Ocean summits. He spoke at one of them. So there was a place for kind of progressive thinkers in the Vineyard at the time. And then when it shifted over to Phil Strout, there was a significant seismic shift in the way that the Vineyard was approaching those kinds of things. So, um, yeah, so that there was just a big shift, and then Michael took the more conservative edge on that for sure.
Yeah, so I mean, you definitely answered my next question, which is, did others in leadership or even in the congregation, share some of the concerns? Um, so talk a little bit about, when um, you first started to raise sort of concerns. What was it specifically that you witnessed or saw that caused you to get to the level where you're like, I need to say something?
Yeah, well, the issue was that you were either on Michael and Brenda's really, really good side, or you were on their really, really bad side. And so it started to happen with me specifically around, again, LGBTQ inclusion. And I was part of the Blue Ocean Network. I was very close friends with Dave Smeltzer and many of the folks that were part of Blue Ocean. I helped facilitate the conferences and whatever. And as I was, sort of adopting a theology that was, progressive and open and affirming to LGBTQ folks, again, that was received. As a matter of fact, the Society of Vineyard Scholars one year in 2000, like 10 or 11, that was the topic. And so everybody was discussing this. And then as it became more progressive, or excuse me, more conservative under Phil Stroud, there was definitely sort of a whistle call to everyone that, hey, this is the direction we're going, and people that have a progressive perspective aren't going to be welcome in this new space. And so there was conflict between Michael and I around some of my theology, some of the stuff I was speaking about on Sundays. Although again, we were colleagues in the same city, so he had no authority over me. Brenda did in a way because she was the regional overseer, but every church is supposedly autonomous until the national office wants to come in and control things. And then when my wife at the time and I decided to transition out of ministry, and we're going to leave our church and transition it to another couple. And that's when things really shifted in our relationship, where they were then trying to be very controlling, meeting with our board without our consent, kind of behind the scenes, trying to do things that were, they were just not ethical leadership moves. And, that's sort of typical. So I'm seeing this really, really good side of Michael for a lot of years. And then all of a sudden, I got on his bad side and Brenda's bad side, and they just decided to make our lives miserable. They were, you know, again, sort of meddling with our local church politics and what we had decided as a leadership team. And our board did not want their involvement, yet they were foisting themselves on us as a local church. They were saying negative things about my former wife and I to other people. We weren't godly. We were leaving in too much time. We weren't doing it right. We weren't listening to Brenda. They were just trying to sabotage us on every front. And then as that was happening, then people started to come forward and say, that has happened to me. Staff members at Duluth Vineyard, other pastors in the region who were all too afraid to speak out and share their experience with the Gatlins. People started to hear about, oh, that's happening to you too. And so I then wrote a formal letter of complaint at the beginning of 2014 to the national, to Phil Stroud and the National Vineyard USA board, because I was concerned not just for me, and I make this expressly clear in that letter, the way I was being treated, because I was at that time no longer a vineyard pastor. I'd left the church, I'd left ministry, but because I had heard of that pattern happening to people, and it went back 2 decades, at the time. So, people started to reach out to me independently and say, I think they just felt like I was a safe voice to say, that's happened to me. I was on their really good side, then I did this, and then they just tried to blow me apart. So it was very, very destructive behavior.
So when you finally decided, that enough's enough, I need to say something, was there a formal reporting process in place, or was it just a situation of like you find an email to a person that you think might be the right audience and fire it off? Or was there some sort of formal structure in place to report these types of things?
That's a great question. If there was a formal structure, I didn't know about it as a vineyard pastor, and I did exactly what you said. I just grabbed as many emails as I could, knowing who was on the board at the time. I mean, a lot of those folks were my friends, and so or acquaintances, good acquaintances, and I just emailed it off, including as many people as I could, because I felt like there was accountability in numbers. I didn't want it to just go to Phil Stroud and have him bury it. I wanted to be taken seriously. I wanted someone to listen to what I had experienced at the hands of the Gatlins, and I wanted them to hear what was happening to other people, because, as I outlined in the letter, I was concerned that these very, these things I was experiencing were happening to others, and they were not just benign. It was spiritual abuse. It was unethical behavior by a local pastor and a regional leader and a national leader, because Michael had a formal position paid by Vineyard USA. So I didn't just bring it to the local church board because Brenda was a regional leader. And so, hey, this is how they're treating me. And the oversight comes from the national office. And Michael was an an employee of Vineyard USA. So yeah, I just sent the letter off via email saying, this is my concern.
So talk about what happens next. What kind of response do you get, and what sort of actions, if any, are taken at this point?
Very little. I received a piece of an email from Mark Fields asking for clarity on one thing I had said about my interactions with Michael. And Mark was kind of a friend at the time, and then just a response from Phil Stroud saying, "You're, bringing this to all of our attention will not hasten the process and the time it takes to deal with this with Michael." And I said, "This is not." My response was, "This is not a personal complaint about Michael Gatlin and me. I can honestly care less at this point if he and I are reconciled in any way. I am concerned because there is unethical and abusive behavior that is, and a pattern of it that is coming forward. And I want to make you aware so that this pattern doesn't continue and that worse things don't happen down the road." And because I wanted to be very clear, I'm putting this to you, saying what I've experienced. It's up to you to do some research and investigate this. And then there's sort of pat answer after that, and that was it. So very little response.
Yeah, and in some of the research I've done, one of the things I noticed as well is that ultimately, it looks as if your concerns are forwarded, back to Michael himself at some point.
They were, yeah. Within a couple of days, they were forwarded back to Michael to address locally, which is like the keys to the sheep pen being handed back to the wolves to say, well, why don't you check this out and see if this is, or if any wolves are eating any sheep, right? It's like, that doesn't make any sense. So yeah, the Vineyard USA, and this is where I have really held the line in my public calling out of Vineyard USA. I didn't want them to be able to just dodge it and say, well, we just thought this was a local issue. And I'm like, that's nonsense. I made it clear that I was reaching out to you because Michael was an employee of Vineyard USA and Brenda was a regional leader that is underneath your leadership. This is not a local issue. And they sort of wanted to just pat it off. And I have yet to receive an apology from any of those original board members saying, yeah, you know what? We should have paid attention to this. And I find that to be just shocking. I just find it to be just lacking complete integrity. We're literally on a board of directors for the National Vineyard USA, and you were in charge. This is the kind of thing you were on the board to do, and you didn't do it. You failed in your leadership, and you screwed it up, and you allowed this abuse to continue for another decade. And here we go. This is what we got. So I don't want those people to be able to just sidestep it. It was on them. They didn't investigate. They could have, they should have, and they didn't.
Yeah, what's also interesting is obviously long after the fact they ultimately bring in a third party, two third party groups to investigate. One was commissioned by Duluth themselves, in Grace, and then Vineyard USA brings in Guidepost. And in at least one of the reports, it suggests that even Jay Pathak, who's now the national director, saw signs of
Yep.
things that were at least concerning and reported them, up the chain of command, and it went nowhere. So
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And there's such an incestuous culture in the Vineyard USA that exists to this day where they would rather protect their own than be honest about any failures within their own. And they offer sort of like opaque apologies like, we are aware that there are things that could have been done better, and could have been set up, but like these are real people that actually didn't do their job. So can we just name that and quit, dancing around the fact that you screwed up and you didn't do what you were supposed? That's literally part of the role of a board. That's what you do, is you keep people accountable, or you figure out who needs to. So don't give me that bullshit. That's not okay.
yeah, I mean that kind of leads to my next question, which is, what do you think needs to change culturally and structurally for churches like Duluth Vineyard and ultimately Vineyard USA to truly like prioritize health, safety, and accountability?
Well, I think the answer is in your question. They need to prioritize truth, health, and safety. They don't. They prioritize um, leadership gifting. They prioritized growth. They prioritized their friends. They prioritized people that are anointed by God. So they prioritize the wrong things. They prioritize, people who can grow churches, people who can speak really great, people who will give their, all of their free time to pastoring a church and doing national, level stuff. And they don't pay attention to the character or the integrity or the way by which those people are doing the things they're doing. So when they find out that, for example, Michael is abusing staff members, verbally and mentally abusive to staff members, they don't step in because he's got the biggest, church growth strategy, and he's doing it all, and he's got 1,600 people, and isn't this great? And then he's on the national team. They need to start looking honestly at prioritizing, the how, and not just the what. It has to be about ethics and about integrity above, gifting and calling and anointing or whatever.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. I grew up in the church. My dad is a retired ELCA Lutheran pastor, and so I am familiar with some of like the church politics side of things and the business aspect of it. And so I know that other denominations and other movements, track metrics to a degree. They track attendance, they track things like financial health and stuff like that. But what was interesting to me is when you go on, even and it's very transparent on Vineyard USA's website, the level of metrics that they track, and how deep it goes. They track salvations and baptisms and church plantings. It really feels more like, and again, this is coming from somebody who is in the corporate world. It feels like very much a corporate structure,
Yeah.
versus a church body.
Yeah. Absolutely, for sure. And I think that the other thing, I think that the National Vineyard office, Donnell Welch, the pastor at Ann Arbor Vineyard, has written a letter calling for the resignation of Jay Pathak, and for a reshifting of that national board. And I think that board, because I mean, it's interesting to me how the same spirit, the same the same flavor of response of not taking my the accusation of a reasonable person at the time, 2014, um and then they downplay it, and they actually then demonize people that bring forward, any questions against the leadership. That same exact thing is happening in the Vineyard today. I have been blackballed. I've been called a bad guy. I have been denigrated. Like they've done it to victims of Jackson Gatlin, trying to question their story, question the integrity of the person. It is disgusting. And I think that whole board needs to shift. I agree with Donnell's call for a complete shift in engagement and involvement of different people. Otherwise, you have basically what is essentially the next generation, but it's the same flavor. It's the same desire to protect their own, their same desire that they lack humility, the ability to just honestly own leadership failures. They think they're beyond question. It's gross.
It is very interesting because I've heard it called. I've interviewed multiple people, from Chris Sauter, who used to be on staff, Ken Wilson, Brian Metzinger, a number of people, who have been very critical, openly critical about the handling of things like what happened in Duluth. And one of the things that I've heard mentioned multiple times is this idea of this good old boys club.
Yeah.
And as I've started to research, this story, one of the things that popped up that I was sort of shocked by was, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and we are a mecca, for vineyard churches, and now the biggest vineyard church I hear in the world out of the entire vineyard is the one that's in Westerville, Ohio here, and was
started by Rich Nathan, who has had a very strong voice and a seat at the table for a long time. And one of the things that came to light was the fact that when John Kluwer, who's now now suspended currently,
Yeah.
um, um, I guess pastor at Duluth, and who has helped handle a lot of the aftermath, told me was that Rich Nathan himself called him, as they were trying to decide how to handle things, and was advising him not to hire Grace. And in his words, not mine, but he said, all of the reasons that Rich was telling me not to use Grace were all the reasons I thought we absolutely should.
Yes. Yeah.
And I thought, I was just flabbergasted. I'm like,
It's unbelievable.
yeah, I'm like, they're victim centric. They work for the victims. That's exactly what a church should be doing.
Yeah, and what's weird is that in that control, that spinning the narrative, that Vineyard, it's so interesting. That's how abuse happens, right? If you don't have the victim-centric perspective and you're not trauma conscious and victims, then you're able to spin the narrative, and the most important thing isn't the victims. It's that the Vineyard itself is protected. And you see that over and over again. The Vineyard leaders should be protected. Vineyard churches should be protected. Our call, our anointing, sort of, they well, yeah, they have these problems, but gosh, are they, they're called and chosen. They're the language that was used in a letter from, I can't remember who it was, one of the national board members, about, we will not, it was the response to Donnell Welsh's letter, we will not step down. We they have been called and chosen and appointed by God. It's like, okay, yeah, they're also fallible. Like,
That seems to come up a lot too. I've noticed in not only the Duluth situation, but the Anaheim situation with Alan and Catherine Scott, is this use of like very heavily loaded spiritual language,
yeah,
in a way that immediately shuts down dissent. It
yeah,
says, well,
exactly.
like, because if you're questioning my authority, you're ultimately questioning God.
That's right. That's right. And that's just gross. It's just this guy, toxic, very toxic.
So, last question for you. What do people need to know? Or maybe what are some things that people don't know that they should, about this situation ultimately?
Yeah. Well, in the end, my voice has been to other vineyard pastors, which I am not, to say to them, do your own research and look at the way the victims themselves have been treated by Vineyard USA, and ask if you're okay with that. You're okay giving the national office your 3% and your adulation for what feels like victim shaming, what feels like sidestepping responsibility, what feels like not victim centric activity by Rob Morgan, by Jay Pathick, by other Vineyard USA leaders, but mostly them, because they're the sort of spokespeople. Are you okay with it? And I hope you're not, because that's not the way we treat people who are victims. So I feel like I'm a low-level victim in all this. I was a vineyard pastor who was filing a complaint, who was, abused by the Gatlins, and then subsequently not taken seriously by the national board. That hurt on a sort of friendship level because of the way I was treated. And then these people who were my friends didn't even, take me seriously. That's like one level of things. Um, the other level, though, is so I'm fine. Like, I'm 12 years removed from this, right? I've done therapy. I'm good. But the way that victims currently are being treated and their families should be shocking to anyone who puts Vineyard behind their name. It should be concerning to a significant degree. And what you have is the National Vineyard Board trying to spin the narrative that they've done all the things and they've done it right. And the victims are saying, no, no, no. We don't feel respected. We don't feel treated well. We don't feel like you honored our perspective. We felt like you were trying to blacklist us and badmouth us. And so my main thing is, if you are part of the Vineyard USA, dig deep. It's on my webpage. The resources are there. There's other resources that you can find. The Duluth Vineyard has an excellent timeline. They are not afraid to own the ways that they contributed to this, as opposed to the Vineyard USA that loves to try to spin the narrative and act as if they treated the victims really well. But then when you hear from the victims, you recognize, nope, they weren't treated well at all. So that would be my, and it's the only reason why I'm spending time on this. I have no stake in the ground. I'm not a vineyard pastor. I'm not a vineyard leader. I don't go to church anymore. I don't care about, other than that these are real victims. And these are people at national level leadership positions that should have more integrity and should be doing this much more ethically. And I find that to be extraordinarily disturbing.
Well, Ryan, I really appreciate you taking some time on. I know we've been chatting back and forth for a while, and I think this is such an important piece of the story. So really value your time and appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, honestly. Thanks for doing this.
The views and experiences shared in this episode are those of the individuals interviewed and do not necessarily reflect the official position of any organization, past or present. This podcast is intended for educational and storytelling purposes only and should not be interpreted as legal, therapeutic, or professional advice. If you or someone you know has experienced abuse in a religious or institutional context, we encourage you to seek help from licensed professionals and survivor-centered resources. Spoiled Fruit, Faith and Power is written and hosted by me, John Williamson, and is a production of John Williamson Productions, LLC. Thanks for listening.
With so many options, why choose Arizona State University?
For me, the only online option was ASU because of the quality. Their faculty was really involved with their students and care about your personal journey. The dedication to my personal development from my professors, that's been extremely valuable to me.
Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.